Welcome back to Gale Force Wins Season 3.
The Gale Force Wins podcast is proudly sponsored by the Newfoundland and Labrador Construction Association. The NLCA provides unparalleled opportunities for its members through industry education, construction information, government advocacy, and networking events. The NLCA is building Newfoundland and Labrador. For more information, visit nlca.ca.
And welcome to another edition of Gale Force Wins. And I got to tell you, what a great day it is here in St. John's, Newfoundland. We're overlooking the Narrows. What a great location to have this next interview. And so, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, hi, I'm Keith Coffen. I was born here in St. John's. I raised basically in a mix of St. John's and Mount Pearl, so I ended up graduating high school in '88 from Mount Pearl Senior High, and went into Munn engineering, and then got recruited by the Navy in 1991. Ended up going to RMC to finish my degree, and then here I am 32 years later.
Keith, when you were growing up in St. John's, was the Navy a big part of your kind of orbit? Were you looking at that, or was that something that was not even in your mindset?
No, so as a kid, I guess, influential people in my life, my grandfather, my mom's dad, who was a World War I veteran. He was a private in World War I, participated in 4 engagements, got blown up in each of the 4, I think, oh, wow. But his closest brush with death was actually pneumonia during the war, but he made it back, survived, and his point of view was always that, military services, it's a part of being a citizen, right? So that was one, and then my other one was my mom's second husband, my stepfather. He was a World War II Navy vet, so he was a Royal Navy gunner, having joined from here to go to Halifax and be trained up and sail with the Royal Navy. And so those two were pretty heavily influential. I myself was an air cadet, and so actually, if I would have guessed then where I would have ended up, I would have said I would have ended up in the Air Force. But as it was, when I got recruited, my work experience leading up to that point actually was better aligned to naval service, and so that's what I was offered. And sure enough, I liked it. It agreed with me, so I stayed.
You know, it's amazing the amount of people that we've talked to inside the military and out, leaders in the community that have come through the Canadian Cadet program. It's unbelievable how many people had that foundation for their leadership development. Tell me about what Cadets was like for you.
Well, I thought it was great. So as an air cadet, really what I wanted to do was fly, right? Mm-hmm. And so, what Cadets gives you, first off is friends. Second off is, a pretty good foundation in sort of civics and citizenship. And third, of course, for the air cadet program itself was flying, right? So I did a glider pilot's license as a cadet, and then unfortunately my path sort of took me out of there before I got the power license. But right. But it was great, right? And I would say the friends was the biggest thing, though. I've got a lifelong friend who's here in Newfoundland now that I made from Cadets, right?
Is that right? Yeah, it's amazing. So it's interesting. I too went through the Cadet program, and just last night I had supper with some mates of mine that we went through the Cadet program with. We're talking a number of years ago, but it's amazing those friendships that form over time. Tell me about now Munn. You went to Munn for engineering, mechanical, or what type of engineering?
So I was in my 3rd of 6 academic years when I got pulled by the Navy, and so just prior to the point where I would have declared a specialty, right? Okay. And so I would have gone mechanical, but as it was, when I got recruited, they offered me the choice between going for 4 years at RMC or going back for 3 at Munn, and I actually opted to go to RMC. Okay. And,
what was that decision all about?
It was a few different things. So one, I had never been much of an athlete growing up, and I was actually interested in playing sports, and I knew that at RMC they had a small population and a big demand for teams, so I figured that'd be one factor. The other factor was learning French, because I'd done a little bit of high school French here, but I mean, in terms of a conducive environment for learning the language, I figured RMC would be better. And the third was, a bit of, call it wanderlust, right? I actually wanted to get out and see a little bit more of Canada. I wasn't widely traveled at all back then, and so it was really to get off and go see another part of the country, right? So.
Tell me about the Munn experience, that first couple of years. What was that like for you? Did you enjoy engineering at Munn?
I did, actually, yeah. Again, made great friends there, right? And did some really interesting stuff. So, my first work term from Munn was working for one of the naval architecture professors that was there at the time, and we were doing and sort of, I was doing a bit of number crunching for them on what are called small waterplane area twin hulls, so catamaran style hulls, but scaled up to do sort of transport ship roles, right? And then the second work term, I was actually in the nuclear power industry in Ontario, working for what at the time was Ontario Hydro at the Bruce nuclear power plant.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you make that transition from Munn and off to RMC. Tell me about your initial RMC experience. What was that like for you?
Tough. Yeah, the first year there, it's pretty demanding. It's physically challenging, it's mentally challenging. You have limited freedom because you can't get off the campus much, because what they're trying to do is integrate you into the culture, right? Like, and improve your fitness and improve sort of, the speed and pace that you can accomplish tasks, because there's a lot to do there besides just academics, right? And so they need to make sure that the folks that go there can survive like all the demands that are thrown at them. And really the first year is about that transition, developing the skills that you need to be successful there.
Now, I bet the theme of friends making friends would apply there as well. Tell me about the friendships that you would have made at RMC.
No, it really did. My group was mostly two things. So I got injured early after I arrived there, so that was the end of the sports teams. So I found my way into debate, was a big one, and then the band. So I was a piper when I was at RMC.
Okay.
And so traveled certainly all over Ontario, a little bit of Canada, for those two activities, and it was great, right? Like
bagpiper.
Yeah. Piping,
okay,
yeah.
Bagpiper from Mount Pearl. You're the first one I've ever met. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I used to drive my dad's neighbors crazy when I'd come down from school in the summers, right? And I'd be playing out in the back, so the kids all liked it, but the neighbors, a little less. Right?
Well, that's great. So it sounds like RMC, mine with all the good experience. Engineering, engineering is so important right now in Canada in terms of getting more people involved, more maybe underrepresented groups even involved in STEM and things like that. Tell me about engineering and why that's so important in Canada's society right now.
Yeah, well, I think we all see it. We're in a heavily technological world, right? And so there's a strong demand for those kinds of skills, right? And the more participation we get from people, the better. It's a tough path, though. Again, it's a set of skills that you got to develop and grow over time, right? And so I would say, like many things in life, it's not for everyone, right? But yeah.
Yeah, and also I would think as an engineer you have to have this kind of burning passion and desire for lifelong learning, because technology is constantly advancing and moving, and that must be a skill that you must have learned early in your engineering career. Yeah,
I was never the kind of kid that would take things apart and put them back together, but understanding how they work, certainly was always important to me, right? And actually, so in the Navy particularly, it's a bit of a partnership, in terms of how engineering works, in terms of keeping naval machinery running. So I spent a lot of my time as a young officer, digging into the books with the sailors and figuring out, step by step, basically troubleshooting problems and getting them fixed. Right?
So before we get into kind of what you do right now in the Navy, take me through your path in the Navy. You leave RMC, and then where does the journey take you?
Yeah, so I started in a frigate, HMCS Regina. That was my first ship after graduation, and what was significant about that when I joined was that they had just lost a sailor when I joined, a fellow named Leading Seaman Hauser, who had perished in a replenishment at sea accident. So a deck fitting had let go and unfortunately ended his life. And so that was my first exposure to safety risk management in the Navy, because actually I was the safety officer for that replenishment at sea crew the first time that they undertook a replenishment at sea after that. And so keeping them safe actually was front of mind. Right? Went from Regina to Huron and spent 2 years in Huron, which was a destroyer. Right? I must say, really enjoyed the time there. Qualified as a combat systems engineer, head of department.
Right.
Went from that to submarines. So I actually volunteered for submarine service. I was one of the last officers to qualify in Oberon class submarines, just at the tail end of their lives. Yeah. And then went across to the UK to help with the reactivation of the Victoria class. And then since then, all but 2 of my jobs have been submarine related. So whether it's at sea or in kind of near shore support, or in Ottawa doing kind of back-end acquisition projects and upgrades and policy development, that's the kind of work that I've done for the most of my career. A couple of things, I went to Halifax. I was the engineering program manager in Halifax, so basically controlling a bit, when ships come in or out of maintenance and ramping them up from maintenance periods into operational status. And then I was also the deputy project manager for the Canadian Surface Combatant for a period of time as well. And then current job is called the Director General for Maritime Equipment Program Management, so it resides in the Materiel Group. So I don't actually work for Admiral Topshee, but I provide him advice, which is why they call me the Chief Engineer of the Navy. And And I guess that's it in a nutshell.
Wow. Well, I'm exhausted just listening. I mean, unbelievable. So yeah, I mean, you would have got a great foundation in the safety part that you talked about, losing a sailor, and that would have been a kind of defining moment in you as a young officer to say, okay, we have to get this right moving forward. And then working on some of those older platforms, whether, you know, the Huron and then the Oberon class, and trying to keep those things in service, that's challenging work, right, for an engineer.
Yep.
Yeah. So now you referred to as the chief engineer of the Navy. So let's unpack that a little bit, because it is complicated, as you kind of alluded to, kind of work for somebody else, but provide that advice to the Navy. So let's unpack that for the audience. Exactly what does that look like?
So I have a division, in National Defense. It's a mixed military and civilian organization. It's about 800 engineers and technicians, technologists, procurement specialists, administrative support staff, and then we have about $1.5 billion of public spending that is granted to us to essentially keep the Navy in service and moving and doing the jobs that it needs to do. Right. And then with respect to the Navy itself, I provide advice to Admiral Topshee in a couple of different areas. So the Navy has its own maintenance capabilities in the fleet maintenance facilities. So 2 of them, one in each coast, about 1,000 people each. And then, I provide advice as well on sort of, how would you say, reshaping, like the, occupation structures of the Navy, how people are trained, right, how they keep themselves safe. So, overall, sort of 6,500 people across the Navy and the material group, right? And then, from the material group side, of course, we have a number of contracts with industry, right? And so when you really get out to kind of the full reach of the activities, it's probably about 15,000 Canadians that we end up touching, across national defense, the Navy, and industry.
Oh wow, that's incredible. So not only kind of keeping the ships moving and the moving bits, associated with that, but also the training aspect as well, right? Advising what is over the horizon, and different fuel types, and all of these kind of complicated questions that we're struggling with as a marine industry. You're front and center in all of that as well. Yeah, that's pretty amazing stuff. And so tell me, there'd be young people that would be looking at the marine sector as for a future career, and as well the Navy as well. Tell me what opportunities exist out there right now.
Well, I mean, they're pretty substantial, right? Yeah. So the one of our key challenges in terms of the call it the marine sector, the naval sector actually in Canada, is having sufficient numbers of people who are interested in joining and interested in serving, right? And so I would say the opportunities are wide open for young folks that like that as a life to kind of come and explore, whether it's in uniform, whether it's in national defense as a public servant, or whether it's in industry. The opportunities are many right now.
Yeah, and there's one thing about I find, and Gale Force Wins has been at a number of defense-related trade shows, whether it's CanSec or DefSec or MASS right here in Newfoundland. There seems to be a really neat collaboration between government, the Navy, and more broadly the government, industry, whether they're the shipbuilders or the companies that are associated with that, and academia as well. Everybody here leans in to this equation, and we often use a term that a rising tide floats all boats. Give me your impression as the chief engineer of the Navy about that collaboration between everybody.
Yeah, no, well, I do think it's a pretty healthy environment that's out there. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of competition, and the government actually requests, right, that industry provide its very best and brightest ideas and put them in competition with one another to win business. But I mean, overall, there's a strong network of relationships behind that, and an ethical foundation in terms of how people relate to one another. And I think it's a pretty healthy environment, right? Like, so we do some stuff on the government side. So we have the Marine Industry Advisory Committee, which is Public Services and Procurement Canada led, that links fundamentally national defense, other marine interested government departments, and industry to talk about kind of current issues, right? And some big ones: Indigenous participation in business, right? Greening the environment, right? And actually innovation, right? What new technologies are out there that actually help us in the marine domain, in the maritime domain, in the naval domain, to keep fleets running at good sort of call it cost effectiveness, right? Especially when you consider that it's public investment that we're managing, right?
So let me pull on that innovation string for a second. There's a lot of cool things happening in and around the ocean sector sector in Canada, and actually right here in Newfoundland as well. Tell me what your vision of innovation is for the Navy and largely this ocean sector.
Yeah, it's so I watch with great interest the establishment of Cove, right, in Nova Scotia. So it's basically a purpose-built maritime innovation hub. I think ideas like that need to continue. Like we do a lot of call it remote sensing, around particularly around characterizing signatures of ships, right, characterizing corrosion effects in ships over time without necessarily having to take them apart to see what's going on, right? So remote sensing technology, digital twinning. Which I'm sure you've heard that kind of term before, right? Which is the idea of creating a digital representation of your asset, that you can then manage, modify. You can do condition-based information storage in the digital model, so you understand from even an ability to predict where things might fail next, perspective, right? All of those things are hugely important, and they're foundational, in fact, to sort of providing better equipment support. In my case, to the Navy going forward. In the wider case, to the marine industry going forward as well.
The Navy's got this great approach. I happened to attend a Navy Outlook event, and you were speaking actually at the event, where you kind of lay out some of the kind of big ideas that you're working on, some of the challenges you might have, and all the industries in the room. It seems like such a collaborative space in there where everybody's leaning into this. And tell me the importance of that for you to have industry and everybody in that room and paying attention to the direction you're trying to take the Navy.
Yeah, well, I think, first and foremost, problems can only be solved when you grip them, right? And so really what I look for is, people to grip the problems and then, understand them, propose solutions, and to be honest, I'm always open to folks, coming in to approach with good ideas, right? It's, I think it's a healthy space. It's full of a lot of really great minds, in fact, that are in that sector, that have their heads up, kind of on the challenges, aging fleets, our recapitalization's a little ways off with the Canadian surface combatant. So, of course, one of the things we're managing is effectively that space where the Halifax class needs to remain, available for mission, needs to remain operationally relevant, needs to be, environmentally compliant in line with government initiatives around greening, right? Needs to respond fundamentally to, what the public of Canada expects it to do. So it's anyway, it is a good, healthy space actually from how we relate to industry. Right? So,
right. I remember once we had Admiral Santarpia on, and he talked about how the people in industry and academia and folks in uniform, they were all serving together. They were just serving in different styles, but they're serving their country. And I thought that was an eloquent way to put it, that everybody there is trying to serve their country in a different way. Very interesting. So, a huge amount of opportunity in the Navy right now. So exciting. I mean, if you look over the horizon here, new ships coming out, sailors being trained in unique ways, a culture kind of and of acceptance, and for everybody here, really exciting. As an engineer, what are you most excited about into the future of the Navy right now?
Well, for me, I mean, I'm all about equipment, so it's all about cool stuff coming into service, right? And so, there's a lot of new equipment that we look ahead to see coming into service, right? And we intend fundamentally to do good work with it and keep Canadians safe, right? Yeah. And and then how would I say, on the culture front, I think we are doing quite a lot actually to basically build a better culture. It takes time, it's slow, but the Navy's changed quite a lot actually, even in the 30 years that I've been in service. And we continue to do that, going forward, right? And
it evolves over time, right? And the Navy, I think, is out front of this thing and trying to be kind of leading that charge, right? Not only within the armed forces, but kind of within society largely, to say this is a very accepting place, and you see it all the time, right? And it changes over time, the Navy, and it's a beautiful thing to watch it change over time. New ships, so you've got AOPS there in the water, Canadian Surface Combatant just over the horizon. I mean, this is very exciting times, right? I mean, I'm sure the first time you stepped on Regina, it probably had that new car smell back then, right? Well, the next generation of sailors are about to experience that. Pretty cool.
Yes, well, and we've got the Joint Support Ship coming as well, in the very near future. So I was actually on the west coast Coast, just about a month ago, actually, and watching that, coming together. So, interesting project, right? It's the longest ship, ever to be built in Canada. And right next to it, there's one of the Coast Guard offshore science vessels that's coming together, and so it is a fantastic time, right? And then behind it, like I say, there's cultural change, and to be honest, it's not just the Navy, right? It's cultural change in the maritime domain. It's cultural change in Canada, and I look internal to the CAF. I would say there's two things, that we're sort of seized with, right? One is a culture of respect for one another, right? And then the other one is culture of service, right? And so, if you put those two together, I mean, that's a really healthy foundation for the future.
Yeah, 100% it is. It really is. A lot of people, we've had a lot of sailors on board, on the podcast, and we always ask them, what would you tell people that are interested in joining the Navy? Because guaranteed, there's people right now at engineering programs across our country that will watch this and say, oh, maybe that's for me. What would you tell a young engineer or somebody maybe in another program that might be considering a career in the Navy? What would you tell them?
Well, I think first and foremost, do it. Join up. It's a great sort of crew. And like you say, irrespective of where in the sector you go. And the second thing I think is really follow your interests, right? Because you'll find that there's quite a lot of different things you can be doing out there. Of course, none of us have enough time to do everything, right? And so it really comes down to following your interests, right? And providing service, in the best way you can while you take care of yourself and your families. For those that choose to have families after, and if I could go back, tomorrow and start it all over again, I would follow the same path. So.
I think that says it right there, right? If you could go back and do it all over again, you would do it again. That says a lot about the Navy, for sure. Tell me what it feels like personally to be stood here in downtown St. John's, right below the Crow's Nest, looking out the Narrows as the chief engineer of the Navy. It wasn't so many years ago you were at Munn Engineering, kind of struggling through it, right? Working under that nav arc instructor or whatever. What's it feel like for you right now to be stood in your hometown as a chief engineer of one of Canada's most important institutions?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, it feels good, actually. Like, I must say, every time I get home, my heart swells a bit, right? And so it's nice, just the smell of the sea air, and I mean, yes, it's a little bit cold, but I mean, it feels right, just happy to be here, blessed to be here, in fact, so I mean, I spent last night, talking to my dad, my brother, before starting with you guys this morning, I mean, I love it here. I must say, Newfoundland will always hold a very special place in my heart, right?
Kind of got to pinch yourself, right? Here you are. That's good. Listen, we always ask our guests, people that have had interesting journeys, and you certainly have had an interesting journey, to leave the audience with a piece of advice. What might that look like from a guy like you?
Oh, well, I would say, advice from me would be, definitely follow your interests, follow your heart, have fun while you're doing it. And I think that's a great recipe for success in any sort of endeavor that folks choose.
Yeah, we thank you very much for that. You described a wonderful journey that you've had, an institution now, the Royal Canadian Navy, in good hands with a great future ahead of it, new ships coming online, an exciting time in a shift of an evolution of its culture, all good things. But all of that doesn't happen without solid leadership from people like you. So thank you very much for providing that leadership to this important institution in Canada. And thanks very much for having this interview with us right here in historic St. John's. It's a real pleasure, and it's a privilege to meet you, so thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you for tuning in to Gale Force Wins. That's GaleForceWins, WINS.com.